So again, kind of Sapir-Whorf and sociolinguistics really tie hand in hand. One of the readings I'm going to have you read is Linguistic Relativity, which is a fascinating kind of idea as well. Remember, always be wary in anthropology when I've talked a lot about binaries and how we like our teams. Anthropologists have done this with theory as well. A lot of people lump themselves into the Sapir-Whorf team, and then a bunch of people lump themselves in the sociolinguistic team. And it really, they both kind of work. And they work together in tandem, really. So combining theories tends to be a much better mode of analysis when we're looking at language or even culture in general. Discourse is culturally patterned verbal language, including varieties of speech, participation, and meaning. A lot of times when we talk about discourse, we could also discuss the dialectic. And I got into this a little bit with earlier about George Herbert Mead's self, right? So if I have a perception or an idea, I can put that out into the ether, the cultural ether, and individuals are going to feedback on that idea. And that's going to have a process in terms of my internal dialectic where I'm either going to change my perception or it's going to solidify, it's going to modify, and it's going to become part of kind of my thinking. So discourse can be part of that, right? Discourse could also be another term for maybe the dialectic. Discourse is usually used when we discuss politics and stuff like that, right? That it's a discussion. So that's part of discourse is really the root of discussion, right? Critical discourse analysis is a fascinating thing that anthropologists are using more and more, especially when it has to do with policy, power, individuals maybe with higher status. And really, it examines how power and social inequality are reflected and reproduced in communication. So again, critical discourse analysis is something that anthropologists would use when viewing the president speak, and not just the current president, but all presidents we've ever had. And maybe senators, politicians, celebrities, people who have higher status in our society. What do they sound like, and how do they interact with language? And really, we're going to kind of micro-analyze that. The written rule of law, and then how that's interpreted by judges and or courts. This is also kind of a fascinating aspect of critical discourse analysis. Tag questions are definitely something that now that you're becoming aware of, you'll hear them all the time. It's a question placed at the end of a sentence seeking affirmation. And the one that I hear a lot currently is right. So people would say, well, it's a beautiful day outside, right? And what you're doing, it's kind of a fascinating thing. It's wanting affirmation, but really you're kind of, that tag question is structured in a way of receiving a positive form of the binary structure of language that we have, which is, if I say it's a nice day outside, right, it's harder for somebody to disagree or have a dialectic conversation with me. It's much more one-sided. I'm tending to kind of basically positively reaffirm kind of my thinking about what the weather looks like. Because usually people will just say, oh yeah, it is, and move on. But if I said, wow, it's a pretty nice day outside, other people might say, well, I like it a little colder. See, I've opened them up without that positive affirmation of the tag question. Language gender subcultures, male and female demarcation in Japan. Kane is male. Okane equals female. So some interesting kind of things around male-female delineation. In the Latin language, it's usually at the end, which is an O or an A or a neutral. So there's some interesting things around language in terms of male-female demarcation. In Indonesia, there's actually what they call gay language in Indonesia. So different gender groups or sexuality have different vernaculars and or lexicons that they use. And it's a separate kind of wholly different language system as well. Second language learners, this is a fascinating piece of kind of understanding, especially going back to Sapir-Whorf and sociolinguistics. There are obviously a lot of different second language learners, and the fascinating thing is that sometimes second language learners think in their own native language and then try to translate into the new language of their locality. So some interesting stuff around that. I've stayed so long in a Spanish-speaking country that I started to dream in Spanish, and this is really where we start to move into like second language learners, as Spanish is kind of my second language, and thinking in that language becomes a fascinating kind of structure. Pidgin. Pidgin is a contact language that blends at least two languages. It's usually English and kind of Pacific Island language. Creole is almost a version of this as well. Pidgin's the language that when you watch the Mead videos, that's what Mead is speaking, and that's what the New Guinea people were speaking as well. So Pidgin's a fascinating blend, a hybridization or syncretization of language so that everybody can kind of understand themselves. Creole is a language descended from a form of Pidgin, but possesses its own native speakers and expands and elaborates. So this is an expansion of Pidgin, really. Global language, a language spoken across cultures, often replaces indigenous languages. This is the issue. Language is more threatened than species on the planet. Languages are dying off very quickly. Currently, the global language is English, and it has been for a long time because English is actually the language of commerce. So as the global economy grows, English will continue to take over other language groups, and colonial powers, imperial powers, will continue to impose their language on indigenous groups as well. Language and history. Historical linguistics is the study of language change using formal methods that compare shifts in time, over time and across space. So historical linguists look at language trees and where different groups of languages have come from. It's fascinating to look up, again, California native languages to see all the different major branches that the language groups in California ended up in. It's fascinating. You'll have big lumps of like a big chunk of Canada being Athabascan, and then you have a big kind of chunk in the desert Southwest being Uto-Aztecan, and then you have Penutian and all these others, and they're all end up in California, and they're all right next to each other. And some fascinating kind of, it leads us to some migration theories as well. Language family, a group of language descendant from a parent language. Again, you kind of have the language trees. Latin is one of those language trees. And you can kind of go back in time and find where Latin and the Germanic languages split. So there's some fascinating things to kind of research on your own if you're fascinated with language. A logograph is a symbol that conveys meaning through a form or picture resembling that which it refers. So a logograph is similar to probably what you guys have seen in terms of hieroglyphics is similar to that. It's a symbol that conveys meaning through a form or picture resembling. So like, again, let's say that we have cave art and we have a mammoth or a bison. That is going to be a symbol for something. Either it's the hunt or it's the springtime and the herds coming in, something like that. Quipu is cords of knotted strings used during the Incan Empire for keeping accounts and recorded events. So actually, this knotted quipu here to the left is language. It is a form of accounting language used in the Incan Empire. So not all language is written, not all language is phonemic. So there are some fascinating kind of ways that people have invented in terms of language and to convey those symbols. Language origins. All animals have some kind of language. Anthropocentric views of language persist in terms of they have for a long time that humans have the most complicated language. No other animals have language. Dolphins have individual names. Literally, like in a pod of dolphins, you could have a Steve or a Bob. And they are distinct. So those names symbolize an individual. And this is a more complex language as well. Calls, grunts, barks, meows all have different tones and describe different situations. So even though your cat might be meowing at you, the meow may be for you to open the fridge, but the meow, this is the tough part. We think, oh, all you want is food. What if the meow is actually saying there's different tones in the meow where it's please open the fridge, please open the fridge, please open the fridge. Please feed me, feed me, feed me. And then the other meows after they're eating are kind of like, thank you, thank you, thank you. We don't really think that in depth. We just kind of simplify other people's languages, or all other animals' languages, and that's very anthropocentric. Human spoken language is millions of years old. We think that Homo erectus and probably even Homo habilis back about 3 million years had spoken language. So we're not kind of unique in this language category. We definitely know that Neanderthal had it, and we are almost positive that Homo erectus did as well. Body language. Pheromones are a fascinating piece of kind of this like hormonal language in a way. Pheromones are hormones released in the air and basically kind of infect our olfactories, and it's more of instinctual responses that we have to those pheromones, because they are kind of this biochemical response that we have rather than them being spoken language, right? Clothing and body art. Clothing is definitely a form of language. I think it's fascinating. Again, we can get into ethnocentric views around people's body language and or clothing. I remember in the kind of when I was growing up in teenage years, sagging your pants was a thing. I don't know if it still is. It probably is in different groups and different kind of age groups. But that was a symbol for being in with your culture group. But if you went into a golf club with saggy pants, now you're going to be judged because situational negotiation of identity, right? Here's the piece. If people are aware that different environments should require different responses in our behavior, then they will judge you or analyze your behavior based on those ideal types. So again, if the golf club's ideal type is a polo shirt and shorts and golf shoes and or long pants, then saggy pants and a t-shirt do not fit that profile or that ideal type. This is where language and body language really start to get into some ethnocentrism as well. Well, where in reality, we can't really judge people based on their clothing and or their body language, because usually those are cultural constructs and they've been informed that this is how their culture groups are basically symbolizing what they believe in terms of language. Micro, sub, and macro language, sociolinguistics, Sapir-Whorf. Again, this is kind of, you need to know those terms. They're huge. Language and concepts that have been transferred to us through enculturation. I was just talking about this in terms of food, right? Or not food. Food would work as well in terms of taboos, right? Like, ew, that's gross, don't eat that. But clothing as well. They dictate how we behave, really, and start to form some of these ethnocentric ideas. So language itself can be very judgy and ethnocentric as well. If you grow up hearing specific racial, political ideology, you will start to believe those things as it's just the way that it is. Again, these mantras, power suggestion is very, very powerful. So when people say that, the power of suggestion, really they say it as cliche, but it is so powerful. That internal thought that you can't get rid of, right? If I say, don't think of an elephant, most people will start to think of an elephant. And then ultimately what you have out of that is that's knowledge transfer, right? And that's what we're good at in terms of trusting information from our elders. That's how we've survived so long. But when you combat that with conflict, that's where we get a little bit of kind of the conflict theory piece. Benjamin Lee Whorf, who's part of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, we dissect nature along lines laid down by our native language, right? Like this has a lot to do with kind of Judeo-Christian, even Babylonian time periods of domination over nature. Language is not simply a reporting device for experience, but a defining framework for it, which is basically we think through language, using language. Body language, micro subculture. Ethnic flags are specific clothing. So I talked about sagging pants earlier, but it could also be wearing bandana or hanky, or some of these other things could also be ethnic flags. A turban is also an ethnic flag, right? It identifies us with to which ethnic group we are part of. Misunderstandings among groups based on binaries of right and wrong. This happens with ethnocentricity. Time and place have a lot to do with language as well, like I talked about with future tense. Why do these social constructs exist? Right? This is a question for you guys to kind of ask. Dressing up for job interviews. This is situational negotiation of identity and language. How do these things change over time are the big kind of questions. And then I will get into language and power in the next section.